And Foster, take it away.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mark. It is a great pleasure for me to be here tonight to talk about this terrific book, Competing with Idiots, Herman and Joe Mankiewicz, a dual portrait by Nick Davis. Our guest is Nick Davis, who's written this superb book. And I want to start, Nick, are you there? Yeah, there you are.
Yes.
I want to start by, as a writer, I know how difficult it is to find the opening for your book. You've got to find something that attracts the reader immediately. And sometimes readers can be merciless. You have to get them in the first page. And you have an opening scene that is a humdinger. And that opening scene for me, hangs over the entire book. It informs the entire book. How did you get that scene right away, or was that something that came through trial and error? How did you arrive at it? And tell us a little bit about it.
Well, it's funny, Foster. First of all, thank you so much for having me at the Lambs or Lambs Club. As you may know, because Foster and I had a previous event where we talked about this. This book took me 19 years to write, which is actually probably underselling how long I'd been thinking about it. But the book contract was signed in the spring of 2003. And it's funny, as soon as it was the opening scene of the proposal to sell the book. It never stopped being the opening scene of the book, even when I had different ways of telling it. I had a totally different kind of voice at one point. But that was always the opening scene because it really was the thing that got me started. Taking a step back, my grandfather was Herman Mankiewicz. My great uncle was Joe Mankiewicz. When I was growing up, 5, 6, 7, 8, I knew that my grandfather, Herman, was the greatest man, the funniest man, the most wonderful man who ever lived. He had died when my mother was 15, so I obviously never met him. But he was incredibly wonderful and magnanimous. And he drank himself into an early grave. But he wrote the greatest movie of all time. That was Herman Mankiewicz. And that's all you need to know as a young boy. And my God, my grandfather wrote the greatest movie of all time, which is black and white. I'm not sure I am ever going to be allowed to see it, but that's all I need to know. Uncle Joe, on the other hand, he lives an hour from us. We lived in the village, and he lived upstate a little bit in Bedford and other places. And I met him maybe once or twice. And he was a very distant figure. And all I knew about Uncle Joe was, he's probably a little ashamed of himself because he made the worst movie of all time, Cleopatra. So that's what I'm inhaling on my side of the family. Herman, great, wonderful, drank himself into an early grave, funniest man who ever lived, one-liners left and right, everyone loved him. Joe, worst movie of all time. Yeah, All About Eve, but that doesn't fit the narrative. Wait, what's this other? I see Joe, he did All About Eve too. It doesn't fit the narrative. Finally, I go to college, I start to understand a few things, and I start to realize, wait a minute, Joe actually had quite a career, and Herman, I don't know, he did this one thing and he was funny and stuff, but you look in the backs of books about movies, Joe Mankiewicz gets a lot more play in the index than Herman does. And when I was 23 and freshly graduated, my dad said, Joe is getting an award from the French consulate. Do you want to come along? And I thought, well, that's weird. I thought we didn't like Joe, but all right, sure. And I go and I meet Joe as an adult, and he was fantastic. He was warm and wise and very funny and self-deprecating as he got this award. And Claudette Colbert was there. And I was like, I don't get it. What's going on? So I asked my dad as we were leaving that event, and Joe was very nice to me and seemed to know who I was. And he looked just like my uncles. And he reminded me of my mother. My mother, I should say, also died when I was 9. So all of this stuff kind of got frozen in my mind when I was 9. And so I asked Dad after we're leaving the embassy, I don't understand. Why do we not? This guy's great. He clearly had an incredible career. The French are giving him this award. What's going on here? And my dad says, well, all right, I'll tell you. And he tells me this story of something that happened. This is the opening scene you're referring to.
Yes.
When, I did all this prelude. I haven't even gotten to the actual story. But the story is that Joe's second wife, Rosa, who had been a very volatile but wonderful European actress, come to America in the late 30s, early 40s to be a kind of Greta Garbo. It didn't work out. Joe married her. They had a very tempestuous relationship. And in the fall of 1958, my mother, 20 years old, graduated from Wellesley, is out in the world. Joe is taking her under his wing. And in fact, after Herman died in 1953, Joe had paid for college and sent her to Europe for a trip. And had been kind of a wonderful, successful, magnanimous uncle in many ways, not in all ways. But one Saturday, and she would host things at his house and stuff if Rosa couldn't make it. One Saturday, he called her up and said, Rosa's upstate at our country place in Mount Kisco, and I can't get her on the phone. Will you come along with me? Let's go up there. So they drive upstate and they get to the house, and Joe says, you check upstairs, I'll look down here. And my mother goes upstairs and finds that, yes, Rosa has killed herself. And my mom discovers the body, and Joe comes up and comforts her. And I think it took my mother a couple of years to sort of think, wait a minute, I'm 20 years old. He couldn't reach her on the phone, so he gets his niece to come up. That was sort of a setup. He must have known. He suspected. She'd been in and out of sanatoriums. What's going on there? My mom thinks, and I don't want much to do with him anymore. And there are other issues at play as well. I hear this story as a 23-year-old, and I think, wait a minute, what? Who are these people? And Herman Mankiewicz, the greatest man who ever lived, he drank himself into an early grave. What is it? How do those two things go together? So, it takes another 10 or 12 years before I finally think I have to investigate this. And that is the opening scene of the book, is my sort of realizing I've got to figure this out.
But Nick, at the end of the opening scene, what's intriguing is you don't answer any questions, you raise questions.
Yeah, well, sure.
And then, in a sense, the rest of the book is an attempt to answer questions you pose, such as, did Joe orchestrate that scene? Is there more than one way to interpret what happened? Is there only one meaning to that scene? How much did he direct it? And that hangs over the book. But what's surprising to me is, after you meet your uncle, your great uncle, you like him, he's still alive, you're a young man, you don't connect, you don't develop a relationship with a living relative whom you like, even though your family tells you have to hate him. You didn't.
No, I didn't.
Relationship.
No, I didn't. And perhaps that's for another book. As for what happened between 1988 and 1993, when Joe passed away, I do include in the book the fact that after his funeral, I went back to his house and people were milling around in a sort of wake-like thing. It wasn't Shiva. Joe was devoutly not Jewish, despite the particulars of his birth, which is to say his mother and father were both Jewish. But and I went into his office, and people are milling around, and I just happened upon his Rolodex. And being a young egotist, I flipped through the Rolodex, and I saw, wow, Paul Newman. It was open to Paul Newman, and I saw a whole bunch of famous people, Sidney Poitier, and a whole bunch of people. But I found myself kind of instinctively looking up my own name and saw, oh, he's got my own name. He's got me. He knows me. He thinks about me. He knows who I am. He knows I live at 320 West 56th Street. And he told his secretary, but that was it. I mean, I did not see him. There may have been one event between 1988 and 1993 when I saw him, but I was, it bothered me a lot when he died. I thought, and especially in the years since, that I failed to.
Is it possible that your long devotion to this book was a way to get to know this man whom you had the chance for a few years to meet, but didn't, but you get to know him through doing this book?
Yes,
because
very much.
After reading the book that you get to know Joe pretty well. You're immersed in his life for all those years it took you to write the book. Is it in a sense making up for what didn't happen in life?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting, Foster. I never considered that. I have thought about it I've known that I had thought, well, I want to figure out who these two guys were, but I haven't thought about sort of assuaging that guilt over not having reached out between 88 and 93. And I've certainly thought, well, I want to get to know Herman and I want to get to know Joe. But it is true. I had the chance with Joe and completely whiffed it and didn't even think about it. I mean, once Dad told me that story, I just thought, forget it. I don't have time for him. And I actually had a girlfriend who had taken a class, or she'd been at the O'Neill Theater Center. And Joe had come in and taught, taught a class there one afternoon and done a class. And she said, it's a piece of work. Like, he's a jerk. He was really obnoxious about the work that they were all doing and the work that was being done out in the world. He was very cantankerous. But I didn't see, he was not that way at the French embassy. The whole thing about the Mankiewiczes is that they, basically thought the world was full of idiots and that the work being done in Hollywood was terrible and the work being done by most people was bad and stupid. And, I think whatever, my book goes into that as well. And is that a healthy way to live? Is it even accurate? If it is accurate, what do you do about it?
But in a way, it feels to me that the book is written for you as a member of this extraordinary clan to get to know relatives past and present. This family that is not close. And there are all these divisions and competitions and schisms that last a lifetime.
Yeah, we're trying.
Animosities.
Yeah.
But if you write the book, you're in a way, it's bringing this extraordinary family together.
Well, that's nice to hear. I just as a member of the family, it's nice to hear that we are considered extraordinary. But I certainly and then I am trying to bring us all together, and I do think that this generation, my generation, is trying. I mean, we try. We have Zooms and text threads where we're all trying to unite, even though we're also being incredibly funny and one-upsman-y in the text chain. And it gets to be a little bit like the Algonquin Roundtable, which I write about, which Herman was a member of, where it's like at a certain point you're just like, stop, I can't do this anymore. Like I just wanted to wish everybody a Merry Christmas or something. I didn't want to get into a whole thing about, whatever, these one-liners flying back and forth.
I have a theory, which I actually shared with you when we spoke before, and it emerges from your book, that there's a villain in your story, a real villain, and his legacy continues to the present. Yes. And that's the father, Franz, of Herman and Joe, who, as you portray him, is anything but a lovable man, who a domestic tyrant, intellectual snob, a desperately unhappy man. I know the type. He's an academic who knows his field, but is sorely missing fundamental issues about how to live. Whatever Franz Mankiewicz knows, there was a ton he didn't know and never figured out. As you present him, I don't like him. I do not like that man. And he had a real damage on his sons. That's how I take it from what you present. Is that how you felt?
Yes, basically. I try to, there's a couple of things. One, look, everyone is a victim of their circumstance and where they're from. And I feel like as a Prussian immigrant at the age of 17, trying to make it in a new world, in a new language, he had no time for frivolity or fun and games, and he drove himself really hard. He also had wanted to be a poet. And so I think that there was an artistic sensibility in him that had been so squashed, but there was a sensitivity that just couldn't get out and couldn't express itself. And he was very, very hard on his kids, on his two boys and his daughter, who he paid hardly any attention to, and drove them mercilessly. But I also think that to the best of his abilities, he did love them. And, so what, I suppose you could say, so what? And, a lot of people have said, like, oh my God, Franz is such a jerk. And I always think, yeah, I guess so. And I did write it. So if that's what people are getting from it.
But he says to Herman, after Herman brings back a grade of 97, where are the missing 3 points?
Yeah. And there's nothing funny about it.
Lived under that for the rest of his life?
Yes. Herman and Joe lived under that for the rest of their lives. And Joe even kind of did that to his kids, especially Chris and Tom. I don't think he did it to Alex nearly as much. But because by then I think he had figured out, like, that's no way to live. But like, yeah, no, what happened to the missing 3 points? And it's not funny. It's not like, hey, because all my life I would get a 97 and I would think, yeah, what happened to the missing 3 points? So the first time I heard that story, I thought, well, he's right. I mean, what did happen to the missing 3 points? You shouldn't have gotten a 97. It was obviously within your grasp to have gotten 100. You failed. What happened? And, but I mean, that just shows how deep it was, because my parents weren't like that. They didn't say that to me, but I got that. And so it took me a while to understand that Franz was kind of, that was not a good way to be.
Was it possible Franz had 2 sons who had great success in a field he professed to have no respect for? But is it possible he resented his son's success, who did better in their chosen fields than he did in his?
Yeah. Oh, sure. And they did better. And even, he did very well in his chosen field. Well, in the field he ended up in. He didn't become a great poet, but he was a very legendary teacher and professor, and had, students years later coming up to my uncle and saying, my God, your grandfather changed my life, all that kind of stuff. But they were so successful financially. I mean, Herman up and down and was constantly losing all his money and gambling it all away. I'm sure he resented their success. It mystified him. But on the other hand, he was also very proud of it. And there were the stories of him going to a movie theater, paying his nickel or dime or whatever it was, and watching the credits, seeing his son's name or names, in the case of $1 Million Legs, and both of them, his sons on a movie screen, and seeing their names and then leaving, because he had no time for the movie, but he was proud of them. Now, taking pride in your children's accomplishments is not the same as paternal love. But it's something, and I don't know why I'm defending Franz tonight.
because I'm being so mean about him. But
it's fine. It's fine.
Let's go to Herman. Who is it? Am I being perverse when I keep hearing how charming he was and how wonderful he was and what a wonderful father he was and what a wonderful husband he was? I almost feel like saying, permit me to doubt.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sure. Yeah.
I mean,
especially
there's a bit of family propaganda there. I think he was probably a very difficult man.
He was a very difficult man. He was a very self-destructive man. No self-destructive man can actually be that great a father or husband. And also, he was desperately unhappy about the way his life had turned out. He did not want to be a screenwriter. He thought he was going to do something great, and he never thought he did. And so even if he was proud and loving towards his children, which is arguable. I think you're right. Like, I quote my mother in the book as saying, like, he was, you would think it would be embarrassing, but somehow you forgave him, showing up to her gymnastics meet in a bathrobe, or bringing a transistor radio to a basketball game because the Kentucky Derby is on and he's got a bet on the Derby. Like, that's sort of awful and cringy, as we say nowadays, but somehow Herman got away with it. Like, he really did get away with it, because he did love you and was there for you and rooting and loved you and wanted you to do your best and was proud of you and all that, and was incredibly funny and charming. I mean, he just was. Some people have charisma, and he obviously had it in spades. But you're right. And certainly, I think I say this in the book, like, he became a much better husband to my grandmother after he was dead. Like, his reputation as a husband went way up after he was gone.
But I thought it was interesting that he and the entire family called your grandmother Poor Sarah.
Yeah. I mean, that was he invented that. He called her Poor Sarah before anyone else. He knew
that was her name. She wasn't Sarah. She was Poor Sarah.
Oh, you mean Poor Sarah? Yeah, well, poor Sarah. She's got to go pick Herman up. He's drunk. The Romanovs can't get home. So poor Sarah will go drive him back to the Tower Road house.
Now, when growing up in your family, was Citizen Kane a constant point of reference and discussion? After all, your grandfather wrote what many of us consider the greatest film ever made. Citizen Kane is a masterwork. And you quote passages of dialogue from the film. Those are brilliant lines. They're absolutely brilliant lines. Your grandfather gets credit, though it's controversial, for writing most of the lines. That's an extraordinary achievement. In a way, you could say, if you wrote Citizen Kane, how much else do you have to have done to have had an extraordinary life?
Well, yes, you might think that. I might think that. He didn't think that. I think he was aware that it was good. I mean, I think that one he was proud of. But all the same, it wasn't like, okay, that's it. I can take the rest of my life off. Like, I still have to earn money. I've squandered and gambled away most of my money. I mean, they were constantly having to move out of their house and move to cheaper belongings, rent out the house on Tower Road, and move, trying to stay in the same school district and all that. But it was boom and bust with Herman. He was such an inveterate gambler. But yeah, I mean, it's a great screenplay. He was enormously talented. Joe was too. They were both very, very talented. And I think, even Joe thought that at the end of his life, he felt he pissed away that's his quote, pissed away most of his talent. But Joe got more out of his talent, I think, than Herman got out of his. Certainly.
But Herman got an Academy Award for writing the screenplay of a timeless masterwork.
Yeah.
Did he ever step back from it and say, well, I didn't become the great playwright. I didn't become the great crafter of literature that I'd hoped, but I wrote an awfully good screenplay. Did he ever say that? Do you know? He never could.
No. I mean, that's the great, I wouldn't have been doing the book if I could have asked him that, but no, the feeling around the family and in everything, the way I put the book together was I did a bunch of interviews myself in 2002, 2003, with, surviving family members and a few close friends. But then I had the interviews, all the interviews that had been done for 2 books in the 70s. Richard Merriman wrote a book called Mank about Herman, and Ken Geist wrote a book called Pictures Will Talk about Joe. And I had all of their interviews, their raw interview tapes and transcripts. And there's nothing that I can remember, and I would have stood out in any of those transcripts that suggests that Herman ever said, Citizen Kane, that was a good one. Like what it makes me think of is a great thing he did say to Joe on his deathbed, where he said, I never had a bad steak. I had good steaks and I had great steaks, but I never had a bad one. Like that kind of reflection about steaks he was capable of, but he didn't say, that was a good script. That one was good.
Was there discussion in your family about the Citizen Kane controversy? Who did what? And you took sides for your grandfather against poor Orson Welles?
Yeah, I don't think anyone in the family really felt like poor Orson Welles. We were all pretty pro Herman. I mean, what happened was historically, Herman had been largely forgotten. And then Pauline Kael in 1971 wrote this long, I think 2-part magazine piece that then became a book called Raising Cain. And in that, she resurrected Herman's reputation and said it wasn't just this one-man auteur, Orson Welles. Herman Mankiewicz is responsible for that script. And she kind of swung too far in the other way. I mean, I think she went too far. And when you look at the actual screenplays side by side, the finished one and the one that Herman returned from Victorville with, you see, all right, a lot happened in between A and B. And that's not all Herman rewriting. That's Orson rewriting and the two of them and everybody working it out as the thing was turned from a screenplay into a movie. And Robert Carringer, who has done the sort of definitive book about the making of Citizen Kane, I think I can't remember the percentage. I think he feels it's about 70-30, 70 Herman. I may be even giving Herman too much credit. I know Richard Merriman felt it was 70-30 Herman, but Goma, my grandmother, Sarah, poor Sarah, she was furious at Merriman for coming down and saying 70-30. I mean, she felt like it was at least 95,
Yeah, that was the script. When you translate the script to the screen, the genius up there is the genius of Orson Welles because we see it in his other films.
Yeah, it doesn't take anything away from Herman to say, yeah, exactly. No,
it's a great script, substantially Herman's, taken by a great director and turned into this timeless film. So it's a collaboration.
Yeah, that's probably. Yeah, film is a collaborative art form, and it's probably not where someone like Herman Mankiewicz should have been, because he was never going to be satisfied. What's odd is I also never came across any indication. Well, it's because he didn't respect movies, but any indication that he wanted to direct. Joe respected movies. When he got out there, he sort of sized it up and said, "All right, I don't know why you're a screenwriter, schmucks with Underwoods." Like the power here is in the director's chair, and that's where I want to be. So he set his sights on that, and because he wanted to say to the world, "Here is my work," and Herman didn't. Herman was like, "Oh, I'm doing this, but I should be doing something else." And Citizen Kane, that was pretty great, but I could have done better if I was doing something else. What? That's the tragedy. What could he have been doing?
But he achieved something extraordinary, and it's sort of a tragedy that he couldn't accept it and say, I did well. Now, tell us, what did you think of David Fincher's film about Mac? First, were you glad that there was such a film? Did it restore Herman's reputation yet again? Did it burnish it yet again? What do you think of the film?
Well, I love the fact of the film more than anything else, more than my critical appraisal of it. I just love the fact that it was made and that it exists, that it's out there, that in the way that I think anybody would love to have their grandfather, if, like, hey, look, they're doing a movie about my grandfather. Now, as one of my cousins said, it's somebody's grandfather. It's not my grandfather. Like, that's not my Herman. But to me, it's sort of like, you know what? If Herman Mankiewicz has now entered the national imagination, and you can have a great actor, taking on the role, and a great director devoting himself with such care and devotion to this thing, that's pretty great. So that's one thing. I would also say I do not trust my reaction. I mean, I'm the last person whose response I would value, because I'm a reed in the wind. when somebody comes up to me and says, didn't you love it? I mean, black and white, the evocation of the 30s, those little cigarette holes in the corner of the frame on the reel change, and, you know, those dissolves and all of that. And it's so shimmery, and, you know, I'm like, yeah, it was great. And wasn't Oldman amazing? Wasn't that a performance of such warmth and wit and wisdom and such a lived in performance? Yes. You know, I mean, I think of it, he was playing a kind of combination, you know, Bugs Bunny, William Shakespeare, and Oscar Schindler. So it's very hard to complain about that.
But was he your grandfather? Was he your grandfather?
Yeah, no, he was not my grandfather. Not at all. No. And I also felt like, you know, if other people come up and say, I couldn't follow the movie and I couldn't hear anything and it was dramatically inert. And once he finishes the screenplay, why does he stay out in Victorville? Why doesn't he get back to LA and this family he allegedly loves? And couldn't they have found an American actor? And couldn't they have found some Jewish actors to maybe play Louis B. Mayer and some of those guys? Wasn't there a quality of improvisation and mess missing from the film? Isn't Fincher, in fact, much too controlling a director for that kind of loose, shambly exercise? Well, I would say yes. I would agree with that person as well. So I don't really trust my own response.
But as you describe it, the film had wildly divergent reactions. There were people who really thought a lot of it, but a lot of people thought it was a god-awful movie. It had such people held to their opinions fiercely. I loved it. I hated it. You're right. You're wrong. You're completely wet about this.
Yeah, and I think that's a sign that you've done something right. You know, but I mean, a lot of people said, forgive me, but they said, you know, that film is so far up its own ass. Like it's not reaching through the screen and communicating with people. But, you know, it's one of those things where he made it for an audience of one. I do believe he made the film he wanted to make. And so, you know, my hat's off to him as a filmmaker. I just think, wow, he certainly did what he wanted to do.
Did Fincher talk to anybody in the family?
No.
No overtures to any Mankiewicz.
There was a sort of semi-overture that someone who was working with Fincher made to my cousin John, but it never connected. You know, it didn't connect before the movie was finished. But you know, I love the fact of it, and I mean, I did watch it 3 times the December it came out, and all 3 times with the subtitles on, so I could follow the dialogue. And I mean, it was something.
You know, it captures something. I feel it captures something about what happened in Victorville when they were working on the script. There's an atmosphere there that I found credible in the desert town. There's something real about that desert town.
Yes.
And people from New York in the desert working on what they must have known was a landmark screenplay. You feel that in the film.
Yeah. I think they captured what it was like just for him to be there writing it. But, you know, they took some very serious liberties. I mean, there was no, you know, a trunk full of alcohol placed out of Herman's, you know, reach. Like, there was a canteen, and every night Houseman and Herman went down to the canteen and had a drink. And Houseman was there to make sure Herman didn't drink too much, but it wasn't this sort of, oh, I'm going to slip him a Mickey so that he doesn't do that again, you know. But, you know, those are just things you do if you're taking a real story and turning it into a movie. I love the fact of it. And, you know, look, I had been working on my book for years, and then I heard about this film and I thought, oh, they'll never make that. And they did. So.
In the book, you talk about the great rivalry between Joe and Herman. And you start out as Herman's grandson. So you start out, I feel, partial to Herman, but I feel in the course of writing the book, you got very interested in Joe and very committed to his work. And you really become a scholar of Joe Mankiewicz cinema. And it seems to me that in the book, as in life, Joe almost steals the spotlight from Herman in the end. That it's Joe's career that overall is the more compelling, and that's the greater legacy, that film historians like me are more interested in Joe than in Herman. There's more to talk about. I feel that your loyalties shift in the course of the book, and that you become, and I salute you for this, you really become a Joe Mankiewicz scholar. You really looked at all of his films and thought about them and did research on them and saw them again. Is there some way in which Joe, in the book as in life, gets the last word against the brother that he always felt grateful to and competitive with?
Yes. I think you're right. I think I sort of instinctively love Herman, because he was my grandfather and all that. But my respect for Joe deepened considerably in working on this, and especially his work. I mean, I feel like he has been, although Criterion's doing something this month on him, and Richard Brody can't stop writing about him. I mean, there are a number of people who really hold him up as an example of a really intelligent, unpandering, literate, what the Times said when he died, literate skeptic of the American cinema, I think is just a fantastic phrase. And I mean, I really wanted to understand Joe. I think it's easier to understand Herman in some ways, especially if you have self-destructive tendencies. But I think that Joe is like, I had to figure out, well, what made him tick? And gosh, he was so successful, but also dissatisfied in some fundamental ways. And as a model, a much better model. Like, who are you going to model your career on? Well, in your 20s, you might think, I'm going to be Herman Mankiewicz. I'm going to live life and drink and carouse and live my life so that I can be spoken about. Not put my genius into my work. That's for everyone else to try and do. I'm going to put my genius into my life. And then, you grow up and realize, well, wait a minute, I'm going to be here a while, knock wood. So I want to have a good career and figure things out. And that guy, Joe Mankiewicz, had figured it out. So what did he do and how did he do it? And he was very intelligent about the way he went about his career. And so, yeah, I loved watching his movies.
Yeah.
Even the ones that I wasn't crazy about.
The work is uneven, but there's a real legacy there. There's really something to talk about. There's a real achievement. What you make very clear is that off screen, Joe had much tragedy and managed to alienate himself from everybody that he could have been close to. His two sons, his disastrous first two marriages, his brother, his mother, his sister. He was a specialist in sort of alienating himself from those who could have been close to him. Where does that come from?
Well, that comes from, I think that comes from Franz. I think that comes from having a father for whom, all that stuff is secondary, and it's all about the career and accomplishment and bringing home I don't want the 97, I want the 100, and succeed. You're not permitted to do anything but succeed. So you drive yourself as hard as possible to be a success in whatever your chosen field is. And if this first wife of yours is suddenly like, she's so annoying, and we don't even, it's like, all right, I'm done with her. And we have a kid, but she wants to custody of the kid. All right, fine. Oh, the kid is going to be adopted by another man and change his last name. That's fine. I'm not even going to think about him. So then there's this other, you mentioned the two sons, but what about the first son?
Yes,
So it's very sad how, but when I'm working on the Barefoot Contessa. I don't have time to think about, this son of mine who I guess he's 18, 19 now. And I don't want to think about him. I don't want to think about the fact that my wife is, causing all this agony. Like, I'm working on this movie, trying to make this movie as good as possible and make sure Bogey knows what to do. And I'm having problems with Ava Gardner because I'm not getting from Ava Gardner what I need from Ava Gardner and what we all want from Ava Gardner. So this other stuff, Chris and Tom and whatever my kids' names are, like, it's not important, And like, I don't know, I get that.
But he paid a price for that, I'm sure.
Yes, he
He
did.
paid
And
a
I mean,
big price for that.
big price, big price.
Big price.
And, you know, I mean, it's, yeah, it's very sad. And ultimately, I like to think that his third wife, Rosemary, and by that point, he kind of knew the game is up after Cleopatra. He did the best he could, but he knew, but you know, the salad days were over. And so he settled into a kind of domesticity with Rosemary. And I think she was good for him, and she did calm him down a little bit. And he was a much better father to Alex, my cousin Alexandra, who you know, is about my age, even though she's a generation above me. And so he did calm down a little bit, but the legacy before then was pretty rough.
I was very interested in the book that you engage with each of the films of the 50s. As we talked about, I'm writing about the 50s, and I'm interested in all of those films. And we don't agree on all the films, but they're all worth talking about. Every one of his 50s films is of interest and has some merit. I mean, there's lots to debate about, but
it's
not only All About Eve that's terrific. It's not only that. He was a very talented writer and filmmaker. All About Eve, don't you think that's an absolute masterpiece?
It's funny. You know, I don't know if you know Letterboxd. Do you know Letterboxd? Okay. So for those of you who may not know, it's this app where you can go rate movies and all that, and you can write reviews and rate them and everything. And you're allowed to pick 4 movies that sort of represent you and, you know, your 4 favorite movies. And my daughter, one of her 4 is All About Eve, and one of my 4 is Citizen Kane. But I love that she, and I mean, I'm this close to picking All About Eve. I think All About Eve is amazing. And earlier, when you were talking about Citizen Kane, what a great screenplay it is, and it's a great screenplay. It's not even as quotable a screenplay as All About Eve. I mean, All About Eve has lines that just, you know, it's about time the piano realizes it hasn't written the concerto. You know, remind me to tell you about the time I looked into the heart of an artichoke. Yeah, I mean, there's so many great lines in All About Eve. It's so beautifully written. But I think it's up there with Kane, and you know, but he did a lot more. There are other mountains in his mountain range. It's not just All About Eve.
No, it's not just All About Eve at all. And in the 50s, you have to admire his eclectic approach. He makes musicals and melodramas and historical films. There's such a broad range, and each one has its own stamp on it. The 2 films actually I want to mention briefly, because I know we've discussed it. We don't always agree. I mean, Barefoot Contessa is god-awful.
Okay, good. Yeah, fine.
Every level. That's a god-awful film, folks out there. See it and disagree with me, but the writing is so heavy-handed. And the problem with Ava Gardner, he couldn't get a performance out of her. But how did he think he could? She wasn't really an actress, and she couldn't play that part. It's a blank up there on the screen. There's a blank in a part that needs a great actress.
Or Gina Lollobrigida, or you know, Sophia Loren, or you know, somebody who actually was that, or was closer to that, would have been much better.
Who was that? It's not Ava Gardner.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. You admire the eclecticism, and I do too. I mean, I think there's something to be said. Well, he does a musical. He does Shakespeare. He does, you know, the sort of Hitchcock one with James Mason. I mean, there's a lot going on. But there's also a question I have, which is, why not stick with what was really close to you, like that thing you did about theater, that you care so much about theater, and it's about the way we live now. I mean, the truth is, he kind of tried with Barefoot Contessa, except that he has this whole plot with the actress, which it doesn't make sense. But I wish he had done more the way we live now kind of movies, because I thought the one he did was so brilliant.
But you think you apply it in the book that taking on these different kinds of movies, he was sort of hiding from something in himself, or that it would have been painful to be that personal or revealing.
Yeah, I don't know what it.
The hidden man. Wasn't he a very guarded hidden man?
Yes, yes. He never really, he admitted that he never really got close to anyone, except for Herman when he was a little boy and Herman was his beloved older brother. He did not expose himself. He was very guarded, very controlled, very controlling. And so I think that there was something he was not willing to explore, and it's too bad. And also he stopped working with a producer who was over him. He became a one-man band. He started his own company. He wasn't working with Zanuck anymore. And
that's an issue, I think, because there's a certain self-indulgence, and he overwrites, and he probably needs an editor, like all of us writers need a great editor. He needed an editor.
And my first pass at this section of the book, our mutual editor, Vicki Wilson, said, you know, I need more on the movies of the 50s, because I was like, oh, Jesus, the movies of the 50s. And I think I took care of all of them in a paragraph. And she was like, you can't.
No, that was a wonderful advice. And you really get so involved in each of the films. And you invite discussion. I'm looking at the time, we have to end up pretty soon, but I do want to talk about The Quiet American, which is a film that's often dismissed. I think it's a very intelligent film. It's far more visually enticing than Mankiewicz's general films. He's often considered a director who favors the written word and good acting, but his films are nothing to look at. All About Eve was a great movie, but it's nothing to look at. You listen to it.
Right.
Quiet American has wonderful local color, and hello?
I just had to pause while I'm trying to mute my dog.
Oh, the dog is responding to something I was saying. I was just about to say, I don't care what anyone says. I think Audie Murphy is ideally cast in that role. I find him moving. I think he's just right. Is he an actor? It doesn't matter. In films, you don't often need an actor. You need somebody with a presence and an essence. And I think he had the right essence for the role. But I would just ask our listeners to see The Quiet American. It's an underrated, overlooked film. I think it's so intelligent politically and visually. And I'm a fan of Audie Murphy. I think he's terrific.
Yeah. I guess, you know, to me, as the biographer and the great nephew, I look at Joe when he's making The Quiet American in 1957, and what's more important to me than is this a good or a bad movie is, what is Joe doing 11,000 miles away from his wife, who is, with the benefit of hindsight, a year away from ending her 15-year misery of a marriage by killing herself? Why is he 11,000 miles away and not working on something about, you know, at least the Barefoot Contessa is about a troubled actress. You know, Quiet American, it's like, what is Joe doing there other than running from his wife? And you know, so I also feel like, as much as I came to love and respect Joe's work, my sympathies just always sort of were natural. I'm a family guy, and so my sympathies were always towards Herman, you know, loyal to a fault, and for all of his problems, you know, gambling and drinking, there wasn't philandering that we know of, or at least successful philandering. You know, there may have been a few failed, fumbled attempts at trying to woo somebody and it doesn't work out, and Herman races back to Goma. But so anyway, that's what and so as a film historian, I hear you about The Quiet American.
But I don't bring the family connection.
Yeah. Well, and nor should you. I mean, you know.
I see a really intelligent, politically prescient and provocative film that hasn't gotten its due. We Suddenly Last Summer is great, don't we? We love that.
It is great.
We love Suddenly Last Summer. We love it. I don't care what Tennessee Williams said. It's great.
It is great.
Joe's most visual film.
Yeah.
Visual film.
Yeah,
and before we end, don't you think that Cleopatra is not that bad?
No, it's not that bad at all.
Oh,
No, especially the first half. I mean, and there's lots of stuff in the second half that's good. I think Burton is great, and Rex Harrison is terrific, and there's lots of great stuff. He needed an editor. He didn't have the time to get the script right. The train had left the station, and he's working his butt off trying to save the studio, and then he gets completely blamed for it. And it was exhausting and miserable experience anyway. So. But no, it's not that bad.
it really isn't. It looks like the millions they spent on it. You can see the millions on the screen.
Yes,
you see it there.
Yeah.
The spectacle is there.
Yeah.
I just think the film's been vilified and trounced way beyond its demerits. It's not a success, but it's not that bad. No. In the end, Nick, what's your feeling about having spent a lot of time on a family memoir? Are you glad you did it?
Oh God, yeah, I highly recommend it. I really enjoyed it. I didn't enjoy every minute, and certainly it was very arduous, some of the writing, and I went down a path and wasted a lot of years doing things that didn't work out. But I'm enormously glad that I did it, and I'm provisionally pleased that some readers are enjoying it as well, and that it wasn't just therapeutic, but it was certainly therapeutic and a wonderful way for me to get in touch with who these guys were, and I find both of their stories and their intertwining story really, really interesting. So it was a privilege to tell the story.
And what I have to say, as a fellow writer, is this Competing with Idiots, great title. This Competing with Idiots is beautifully written. You have your own voice and your own sentence rhythms. A little dangerous for me to read you when I'm writing, because you have these wonderfully long, complicated sentences. And I thought, well, if Nick can do that, I can have my long sentences too.
Go for it.
They're your long sentences. They're not mine.
Well,
it's your rhythm. You have developed your own style and tone and rhythm. And it's a beautifully written book, but it's also deeply personal. The style is yours. The voice is yours. Did it take you a while to get that voice? Or was it like there at the beginning?
Yes. No, it's not that I think that is my voice, and I have written other things in the past that maybe had that voice. The book, when I first started writing it, did not have that voice. I was writing it as if I was composing a Wikipedia entry, and it was very boring. For many, many years, the book was putting me to sleep. And I finally had an insight that turned out to be wrong, which was, I know why I'm so bored. I need to put myself in this. So I then wrote not just the story of Joe Mankiewicz and the story of Herman Mankiewicz, but the story of Nick Davis. And I was fascinated to weave my story and my biography in amongst theirs, and all the parallels and the lessons, and he did this and I did that. And I gave that to my editor, and she said wisely, okay, and I'd finished. I finally finished, after years of not really making progress. And I gave it to her, and she said, great, this is what you needed to do in order to write it. Now take yourself out of it. And after much kicking and screaming, I sat down one afternoon and I just cut 150 pages, all my sections, printed it out and read it straight through. And I realized, the book has a voice, it has a perspective. It's the story of the two of them, but it's coming from me now. And why I had to do that in order to get the voice, I don't know, but I did. And from then on, it was still another 6 or 7 years, but I had it. And then it was just a matter of like, okay, I need more on this. I need more on Joe in the 50s. I need more on, Herman in Berlin.
But with all that research, finally and ultimately, it's a voice written by a family member. It's written from within the family. As a film historian, I couldn't have written the book.
Right.
Even though you deal with film history.
Right, well, that was the problem with the first version of the book. I was writing as a film historian, which I am not. and trying to, you know, and it was just like, who needs this from me, you know? Yeah.
Yeah, but you when you do present film history and you do it commandingly, it's always filtered through the family perspective. It's film history from a particular point of view and funnel. It's not an objective outside point of view.
That's right. And that's why, like, for instance, The Quiet American, I think what I said to you now is basically what I say in the book. It's like, yeah, all right, it's commendable and it's prescient and all that, but what was he doing? And so, yeah.
Which is not a question I would have asked or even thought of that.
No.
But it's a pertinent question for you.
Right.
Before we open it to questions from the house, tell us about your wonderful father, who's a documentary filmmaker of some renown.
I know. And the horrible thing is, and I should have invited him to this because he would have been happy to be here, but we'll send him a clip. My father, Peter Davis, is a fantastic filmmaker in his own right, or was. He no longer makes films, but he's lives now in Maine, in a small town in Maine, which is the town that my mother's English professor, beloved English professor at Wellesley, who was himself a poet, he lived there, and they went up and visited him once, and they both fell in love with the town. And then years later, my dad moved there, and lives there to this day.
And he is the director of the extraordinary film Hearts and Minds.
Yes, sorry, you probably wanted the more professional. He made the seminal Vietnam War documentary, Hearts and Minds, which was a terrific, although, you know, when you're 9, I thought it was, I mean, it's brilliant. It's no less brilliant, but I thought it was very objective. And it was here's the Vietnam War, here's what's happening. And you watch it now and you're like, no, this director he's got an axe to grind, and he's got a point of view, and it's a very strong anti-war movie. It's great. And so it's one of the great.
Does your father speak about the film? Does he give lectures at all now, or is he retired?
Well, I'm sure you could have him, you can find him. Yeah. He does. And you know, it's funny, the film, I mean, as films do, the film sort of came back into the consciousness when the Iraq War started, because then people started looking at it and saying, wait a minute, we're doing this again. And so he had there was another sort of second life that this film had in the early 2000s. And yeah, no, he'll talk about the book. I mean, about the movie any old time.
Okay. Folks, this is a must-read book. It's fabulous, beautifully written. Once you start, you can't put it down. You can see what an engaging person Nick is. He's just as engaging as a writer. It's wonderful spending time with him in person and on the page. Mark and Magda, do we have?
Yes. Can I ask the first question?
Mm-hmm.
May I ask the first question? Could you tell us about your family members that are in the film business? Who are do you have many of them, or just a few?
Well, there's a few. I mean, so on Herman's side, there is my cousin John Mankiewicz is a television writer. He has written for shows ranging from Miami Vice to House of Cards to Bosch, and is a terrific guy. And his sister Jane was a New Yorker short story writer. And so that's that side. And then, Herman had 2 sons. Don was a television writer. He started Marcus Welby and also wrote for Ironside, and wrote a Susan Hayward movie for which he was nominated for an Academy Award. And then
Nick, is Don Mankiewicz the author of Trial?
Yes, he was also a novelist.
That's a terrific novel and a very brave one, and a very good film, overlooked, from 1955. Yeah. Overlooked, politically very daring for its time.
Interesting. Well, that's great. Anyway, so that's Don, and Don had 2 kids, John and Jane. And then my other uncle Frank was not in the movie business, was in politics, was most famously Bobby Kennedy's press secretary, and ran McGovern's campaign. And Frank's 2 sons, Ben is the host of TCM movies, and then Ben's older brother Josh is on Dateline. He's the Dateline correspondent who coroner's, accused murderers. And so that's Herman's side. And then on Joe's side, Joe had Tom, who wrote, a bunch of the James Bond movies like Live and Let Die and Superman, and then was the creative consultant and kind of started, I think, Heart to Heart, the television show with Stephanie Powers and Robert Wagner. And then his brother, Chris, has been in the movie business in sort of studio jobs and stuff like that. But Chris has a very complicated relationship with Joe. And then, so that's who's in the business. And my cousin Alex is a graphic artist in Australia. And my brother, Tim, he wrote for TV for a little bit, but he got out of the business happily. Now works in the mental health field.
Any other questions from anyone?
I think people wrote some questions. I kept seeing the chat.
No, that's just me telling people they could write questions.
Maybe you could unmute some people so they could speak. I think, Susanna, do you want to?
They have to unmute themselves.
Can you unmute yourself? Okay. If you want to speak, just raise your hand and unmute.
There we go. A couple of questions. First of all, Nick, I love this book. I'm a slow reader, but I'm savoring it. I just adore it. I came upon the pages 116 to about 126 today, and I love the piece that you wrote about how Joe had to fire F. Scott Fitzgerald. And in those pages, you really explain how a narrative writer such as a genius of F. Scott Fitzgerald could not understand the craft of screenwriting. And I think your book does a lot in terms of telling screenwriters what can work and what can't. So I'm very grateful for that in the book. And I also wanted to ask you, was Jonathan Shields from Bad and the Beautiful modeled after Joe? Because there's a similarity, the way you describe it.
I think that's a question I can't answer. I don't know. I wonder if Foster has any ideas about that. That's a very, what I do know is that a lot of people thought that Sammy Glick from,
What makes Sammy run?
Yeah, a lot of people thought that Sammy Glick was based on Joe. That sort of grasping ambition for the sake of ambition. But I don't know about The Bad and the Beautiful. It's a really good question.
But thank you for this book. It's wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Anyone else? You can unmute yourself. Okay, Tandy. Just unmute yourself, Tandy. Can you unmute yourself? Can you do that, Mark? Can you, she's having trouble unmute. I can't.
They have to unmute from their side.
Okay, try to unmute from your side, Tandy. There she is. Okay, now you're okay.
Finally, it kept telling me that the host doesn't allow us to unmute ourselves. So, this brings up so much stuff. Joseph Mankiewicz was my godfather and a huge presence in my life, from the age of 12 on. So the whole Cleopatra debacle, I was kind of present for that because I was at school in Germany, and whenever I had vacations, I went usually to Italy to join my mother and father, who were, my father was Hume Cronin, was stuck in Italy for a whole year.
Yeah.
Filming Cleopatra. And I can remember a conversation, and it was Elizabeth Taylor. They already knew the picture was in big trouble. It was way behind schedule. And the problem was Joe insisted on writing the script himself, but there wasn't the time for him to write the script and then cut it and then shoot it. And I think that had to do with Elizabeth Taylor's commitments. They had to plunge ahead and film before the script was written. And it was an absolute disaster. But I can remember Elizabeth Taylor saying, oh, for God's sake, if William Shakespeare were available to write the script, Joe wouldn't let him because Joe wants to write it himself. And
towards, the second half of his career, that was, I think, very much a thing with him, that he wanted to write it, not just direct it. I mean, he wanted the whole thing to be his. And of course, I had a conversation with him, and I think this was long after Cleopatra, but he told me that when he wrote, and he was admitting that he overwrote. I mean, you're so right when you say that he was much more attracted to the written and spoken word than he was to the visual. But he told me that when he wrote a script, he would write something first round, and it would be like this, and his fingers were 2-3 inches apart. And he said, and then I had to cut it by at least a third. And he did this little mime of taking a dagger and cutting his flesh from around his heart. Oh, how painful that was to cut. But he did that, but that's what he couldn't do with Cleopatra, because he was writing it as he was literally writing the evening before what he was going to shoot the next day. And that's why they ended up with a picture that was 6 hours long. He wanted the studio to turn it into 2 pictures, Antony and Cleopatra and Caesar and Cleopatra, and they weren't willing to do that. So they just slashed it. And that picture did indeed destroy him. He never got back to the creativity that he had before that. I disagree with you slightly about how tough he was on all his children. Yes, and I was a witness to this. He was terribly tough on Tom and Chris. But later in life, with the marriage to Rosemary, and suddenly having a daughter when he was older, he mellowed.
Yeah, he did mellow.
He mellowed a lot.
Yeah. No, I think, and I thank you. God, it's wonderful to see you and meet you. I think he definitely mellowed with Alex and with Rosemary, but I think in his own mind, he wasn't at peace. He wasn't someone who, from 1972 when he made his last film to 1993, he wasn't enjoying a quiet, easy retirement. He was bedeviled by demons and a horrible decades-long case of writer's block. Yes. Because he never felt like he had accomplished what he should have accomplished because of Franz.
Well, I heard this, of course, from my father. Joe never talked to me about this himself, but my father said, Joe has always said he wants to write a play.
Right.
Lifelong, he was going to write a play, and he never did.
No.
But that was a much more respectable kind of work to him than writing for the movies.
Yeah.
I mean, go figure. I mean, why?
Yeah, I know.
And just one other thing I have to say about Joe. He was one of my father's best friends for many, many years, until, later in life, he kind of withdrew. But my father said, he was I don't know why, he was explaining to me why he was so fond of Joe. And, of course, there was this extraordinary wit. I have never laughed harder than I ever laughed at stories that Joe could tell. The talent and the intelligence and the wit and all that. But my father said the thing that endeared Joe to him the most was his vulnerability.
Mm.
There was something extremely vulnerable about him.
I think that was true artistically. I think that on a movie set, I think he could be, in some ways, I mean, it was his set and he was commanding, but I think that he loved his work and he threw himself into it creatively. And so when he would have a conversation with an actor, in particular with actors or actresses, I think that he connected on a really deep, hey, we're making make-believe here. And he could be human and could be vulnerable. I think in his personal life, he had a much harder time doing that. My sense.
What my father was talking about, I think the vulnerability he was talking about, I think, was personal.
Really? Yeah. I think it's rare.
Probably very hidden.
Yeah. Yeah. I think he showed it to very few people. I think he showed it to Robbie Lance. I think he showed it to your dad. And I think he showed it to to one or two others, like not like none of the cameramen he worked with, I don't think would have known it. But I think there were a few people who sensed how vulnerable he really was. I mean, my mother sensed how vulnerable he really was, but he usually, put on the tough guy controlling director. Yeah.
That's all I have to say.
Okay. Well, and he was at, I think, is it the Bahamas or one of the Cays or wherever in the Caribbean with your parents when
my father actually had a key. Children had a key. And
that's the one. Yeah.
And yes, he did come to visit.
Yeah. Well, so Joe was down there and he was working on the Alexandria Quartet, which was going to be his great, his next great film. And that's when he gets a call, hey, do you want to do Cleopatra? And he said, I don't even want to read Cleopatra. I don't want to see Cleopatra.
He told this story that when he was offered, I'm
the Jacqueline Suzanne. I'm confusing it, but the Jacqueline Suzanne one is that.
He says, how much you going to
pay? A step deal. How much will you pay me to read this piece of shit? Yeah. Yeah,
but he was offered Cleopatra. The only thing I know about that was my father said he was offered a deal that he thought would make him independent, and that was why he swallowed hard and decided to do it. And of course, it was a complete disaster.
Yeah, it was a complete disaster, and it he was only 54 when it was over, but he had lost what he had, and he made some more films, and Sleuth is pretty good. I mean, Foster, we didn't talk about Sleuth, but Sleuth is pretty good. But that was the one to go out on.
Yeah, it was a good one to go out on. Well directed, well acted. Yes.
Yep. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question.
Okay, let me step in and ask it. So bring this full circle. Nick, tell us what you're doing now. Tell us what you're working on, your own projects and goals.
Well, I am a documentary filmmaker, and so by trade. So I just finished a film that aired on ESPN last fall, a four-part documentary about the 1986 New York Mets and New York City, which was very near and dear to my heart. I'm a huge Mets fan, a big baseball fan. So I just finished that up, and I've got a couple of other things that I'm developing, but I haven't signed any contract, so I shouldn't be talking about them just yet. But I'm very excited about two of them in particular.
And
but the Mets one was near and dear to me. What's that?
There'll be some more writing. I think there's another book in you, right?
There is another book in me, and I have started taking notes, and I just know it's going to take a long time.
Okay, well, but we have, this book took, how long did it take now?
That took, officially it took 19 years.
19 years.
And that, I started it as a documentary that I was going to do for PBS's American Masters series. And I started that in the summer of 2002. And then that Christmas was at a book party, was at a Christmas party, and ran into a friend who's a book agent. And I explained what I was doing. He said, well, you should do a companion book to your documentary. And I said, oh, that sounds fun and easy. And needless to say, the documentary still has not been made, and the companion book is now a companion to nothing. But it exists.
No, it exists. It's a companion to all of us who love films. It's absolutely required reading. A terrific book.
Thank you.
Competing with idiots.
Thank you, and thank you all for attending this. And it's wonderful to be here. Thanks.
Thanks.
Good night, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.